What's up, my loves? My name is Paige, this is Pages with Paige, and today we're going to be discussing my April wrap-up. For the Owl's Magical Readathon, I was aiming to gain the career Trader of Magical Tomes, and I superseded that career choice. So I managed to accomplish all 12 Owls plus some extra books, reading a total of 19 things in the month of April. Collectively, that was 6,752 pages, and I'm very proud. There were a few swap arounds from my original TBR, just the situation happened where I was reading these books and then hadn't intended on, and so with the page count, figured why not bump it up. I still read all bar one book that was originally on the TBR. So yeah, let's get into this because there's a lot to talk about. Also, again, I'm really sorry about not being articulate with words. Does that not just prove my point? I will talk through the books and my ratings. The first thing I read in the month of April was Nimona by Noelle Stevenson, and this was to fulfill the prompt of Transfiguration, read a book featuring shapeshifting. And if you know, you know, but the shark body, I lost it. I gave Nimona 5 stars. I absolutely adored it. I thought it was a hilarious standalone and was just an interesting story where you turn particular tropes on their heads, and I really enjoyed seeing the different dynamics between the characters. Also, the representation in it was very cute. The next book I read was Sea Prayer by Khalid Hosseini, and this was to fill the prompt of potions, read a book under 150 pages. So this has 48 pages in it, so definitely well under that category, and I gave this a 4 stars. I thought it was really beautiful, and the illustrations as well as the content within it are absolutely marvelous. It's just targeted at a younger audience than I am, so I could appreciate what it was trying to do in telling a story of refugees to young children, but not being the target audience myself, I could connect to it, but I didn't love it. The next book I read was Happily Ever After and Everything in Between by Debbie Tung. This didn't fulfill an Owl's prompt. I just received an arc from NetGalley, and so I thought I would read it. And I gave this also 5 stars. I thought it was hilarious and reminded me just how single I am. So it's following Debbie and her partner after getting married, and her previous comics have been focused on the dating stage, introversion and book love. So to then follow her having found her life partner and just all the cute things they do together, it did make me feel a little bit alone, but I still really loved it. I thought it was just pure and wholesome, and that's the kind of thing that you want from these comics. It's just a feel-good time, and going in not expecting the world, just expecting a good time. So my expectations were hit and then exceeded. Oh, I love all of her books, and I can't wait to see what else she creates. Next I read Solitaire by Alice Oseman, and this was to fulfill the prompt of Ancient Runes, read a book with a heart on the cover. So also the heart here, but there are also tiny little hearts in the pixels, which I thought was really cute. Unfortunately, I did only give this a 3 star, and for me, a 3 star is like, it's okay, it's good. It just didn't do anything more for me. I'm really conflicted about this because the protagonist suffers from depression, and the way that she acts towards people is quite... I could see a lot of people being able to relate to it and the actions that she undertook. But at the same time, even if you have a mental illness, that doesn't justify being a dick to other people. And I just found her so rude and annoying. And it wasn't because of her depression, it was just she wasn't a nice character. So I know that Alice Oseman drew quite a bit of experience, and this was also her first novel, which I think she wrote at 17. I think not being a teenager anymore, I just don't have the kind of patience to deal with that particular kind of teen. I was that kind of teen, I understand. And I think that's where I've had enough personal growth to not be able to relate to it in the same way in characters in a book now. Next up we have Be Not Far From Me by Mindy McGuinness, and this was not originally on the TBR, but since I didn't get to The Dark Vault by V.E. Schwab, this is now my charms prompt, so read a book with a white cover. And I am so happy that I waited to read this with Sam from A Bee and Books, because I had originally started reading it and then stopped, and she was like, oh, I'm going to get that one, can we read it? I was like, yeah, sure. So I just didn't continue on until April started, and I am so glad, because this, it's not horror, it's not a thriller, but it's also not pleasant. There is one scene with the flint, and then the raccoon, and damn, Mindy McGuinness knows how to write. So for me, this was a 4-star book, mostly because it's just, I don't love those kind of books that make me feel uneasy, I suppose. It's the kind of book that I appreciate existing, and it's harrowing. It's also very similar to the scene from Hatchet with the pilot in the lake. And I feel like that this book just continues on that similar vein, and being uncomfortable whilst reading, it's something I'm happy to do. Like, I'm going to read Off Season in June, which, whoop, Lord. But yeah, so it's just not ever going to push it into the 5 stars for me unless it's absolutely phenomenal in the rest of the conversations that it's having outside of it being gory. But I went in knowing that it was a survivalist story and that it was probably going to be dark, because that's Mindy McGuinness for you. So yeah, still really happy to have read this, and thank you, Sam, for buddy reading it with me. Next up, I read Feminists Don't Wear Pink and Other Lies, curated by Scarlett Curtis, and I really enjoyed the different essays that were on here talking about feminism and what it means to each individual. It's categorized into different sections, so essentially your progression through feminism. So first off, it starts with epiphany, anger, joy, poetry break, action, and education. And I find that that was a really valuable way of doing it, because it introduced you to the topic and then progressively shows you the different ways that people address feminism, how they feel towards the subjects that feminism deal with. I really enjoyed what this had to offer. I felt like I learned a lot, because I don't have that strong drive. I just know how things should be, and so seeing like the anger and the joy and being able to celebrate women and all that they have to offer on an even playing field, I really did enjoy that, and I thought it was very valuable to read. I also listened to the audiobook through Libby, which I was really happy with, that my hometown's local library, which I still have access to, was including it in their curation. Back to the Owls, I read Wizards of Once by Cressida Cowell, and this was the middle grade monthly pick for the month of April, and I really enjoyed it. I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars. Listening to the audiobook narrated by David Tennant whilst reading along is the best way to consume this story. You've got pictures, you've got sound effects, you've got everything going for it, and I just felt like overall, the plot would be a 3-star read for me, but with David Tennant's narration, that upped it to the 4-star, just oof. And I definitely want to continue on with the rest of the series and find out just how this all plays together, because this is following a boy and a girl from opposing tribes, and at the end, we're sort of introduced to a bigger bad than either of them could see. And so I'm thinking maybe they might have to learn how to work together. And I think that would be an interesting dynamic to continue following. I love Squeegees and the Spoon. I thought they were so adorable, and I am a sucker for adorable characters. Also, the family dynamics in this were very intense, but I appreciated what it did. So this fulfilled the prompt of History of Magic, read a book featuring witches or wizards. Next, I read The Power in the Storm by Tamora Pierce, and originally I was using this for the astrology prompt. However, there is another book that worked to fit the prompt and contain more pages than this quick read. I really enjoyed it. I gave it 4 stars. I thought that the story continued on in a nice way. This is the second book in the Circle of Magic quartet, and I love Tamora Pierce's writing. I love her fantasy worlds. I think she is really a fantastic author for building up the different kinds of magics that exist within a world, but the characters read so young. And like I said earlier, I think it's me growing out of being able to relate to such a younger protagonist, I suppose. I can enjoy the story. I enjoy all the components of it, but when it comes to having that connection with the characters, I feel like I'm losing that connection. And yeah, so this was still 4 stars. I really, really loved it, and definitely will continue on with the quartet and the rest of the books in this series. I'm just hoping that maybe the characters will age and we will follow them making less real interesting choices. But yeah, definitely recommend this. I still love it, and I love the elemental kind of magics that exist in here. Next up, I read Lovely War by Julie Berry, and this was to fulfill the prompt of arithmancy. Read a book outside of your favorite genre. So this is historical fiction, and I was really apprehensive about going into it. I did know that it contained the Greek gods as the narrators. So there was Hephaestus, Apollo, Ares, Aphrodite, and Hades. And so I was intrigued to see how they narrated the story, but I was nervous about the actual story that they were telling. So surprise, surprise, I gave this 5 stars. I adored every second of it. I loved hearing the gods talk, but then when they were telling the story, I didn't want to go back to them. I didn't mind when we did, but I was so invested in essentially the love stories of these 2 couples taking place within the war, and I cried. I was also reading this with Cara from Biancareads, and yeah, she got quite a few messages of me just being like, my soul is dying, help. I highly recommend this, even if you're not a historical fiction fan. Give it a shot and just see how you go with it. Obviously, if you're not feeling it, put it down. Like, there's no harm in DNFing a book. But I feel like it's well worth it. My book did go through a little bit of trauma. So I was holding a foster puppy, and 7-month-old puppies don't know not to eat books. So yeah, but at least the cover looks great. Definitely pick this up even if you're not a romance or historical fiction reader. I think you might be surprised. Next up for herbology, I read My Dad Vanessa because that fulfilled the prompt of Mimbalus Mimbertonia. Read a book starting with M. And so my is that M. And oh my lord. Ow. My heart. My soul. So this is following our protagonist in 2 timelines. One when she's a 15-year-old girl at a boarding school, and the next when she's 32, I think it is. And there are being allegations made out towards her first love, who also happened to be her teacher. Trigger warnings for pedophilia, grooming, emotional manipulation, substance abuse. That's not like heavy, but it's still there if you have an issue with that, and underage drinking, and suicide. So yeah, this book broke me in 1,000 different ways. I think it is so important to have this in the hands of adults that are struggling to come to terms with their trauma as kids. Reading about it probably isn't like the best thing, but I feel that if you've been in those situations and you still harbor those feelings, it provides a really good example of how you don't have to say anything to make a difference. It's just in yourself. This is the start of the story was following Vanessa holds herself in love with her professor, and at the beginning of the book you can see where she's coming from, but it's also strongly stated that no, girl, you've been manipulated into this situation. It's not love. The way that she reacts during the first scene just broke me in 1,000 different ways. And also has me reflecting on my own past relationships in a way that I didn't realize could actually be considered unhealthy, I suppose. yeah, it's just got me reflecting. I read this in the second week of April and it's still stuck with me and gets me thinking just about all the different environments and situations that people have been in and the trauma that they go through and just how strong and brave people are to overcome these sort of things. Yeah, so I think this is a really valuable book. I know that April and Kyra are reading it soon and I'm nervous that they're not going to like it. It's okay if you don't. Like, I understand 100%. I've told my mum not to read this because she cannot deal with pedophilia, and I respect that. But for me, it just hit so many different levels of feelings that I loved it. And yeah, I can't remember if I said, because I've been rambling for like 10 minutes, but five star. Right there. Next on the list was When Temple Met Rishi by Sanya Menon, and this was for Muggle Studies, read a book from a Muggle's perspective, or a contemporary. I really thought this was a cute love story, 4 stars for me. I had laugh out loud moments where the characters were just being themselves and it was hilarious. I also related to Rishi on such a personal level, considering he's Indian and I'm very not. His responses to just situations had me cackling because I was exactly the same. One example is a brownie that he hasn't seen made. Yeah. Good fun stuff. But yeah, I read this after my Dad Vanessa and I feel like I got so much more from it at the time because it was what I needed. Next up was Access Restricted by Gregory Scott Kasoulis, and this was for divination. I had to randomize my TBR and then this was the one that got selected, and this finished off a duology. The words duology, I believe. I read All Rights Reserved, which is the first book, I think either in 2017 or 2018, and I adored it. I thought it was a fantastic take on something that I hadn't seen before. The US have copyrighted practically anything, so you cannot communicate without it being charged. So facial gestures, actions of some description, and words have all been copyrighted, and people cannot afford this. So they get indentured, and our protagonist then decides to going silent, and things go from there. For Access Restricted, I gave it a 4 stars, and I think that it is generous. I felt like everything wrapped up in a way that I was happy with, but at the same time, it just missed something. And it might be because I read All Rights Reserved so long ago that I wasn't in sync with it, but yeah, there was just something a little bit lacking. So still a 4 star, really enjoyable book. I binge read the latter half of it. And I think maybe it was the beginning started off slow, which is weird for a high action dystopian book. Yeah, that's definitely what it was. So with it being so slow for the first bit, it took me a while to get into even listening to the audiobook. And so when you want that fast action paced, get to the guts of it because you're in the middle of the guts already, I felt like, yeah, still really good. Would highly recommend the series. Just read them back to back. Next up was one of our switch outs, and so this was originally going to be The Power in the Storm, and that is the astrology prompt. Read a book entirely at night. So your girl here got fixated on a jigsaw and worked on one for 13 hours straight. That 13 hours also ended at 5 a.m. Yeah, listen to the entirety of Tweet Cute by Emma Lord whilst doing this jigsaw puzzle, and I thought it was fantastic. It's cute, it's fluffy, they've got tension, they've got just so many different elements to it that made it so wonderful. And normally I'm the kind of person that needs to read along while I'm listening to audiobooks, especially when I've got them sped up. But doing this jigsaw, I was consumed by the story. I just loved every element of it. And Pepper and Jack are just 2 hilariously wholesome characters, and I loved their dynamic. I think each aspect that was introduced, so there's a don't like each other face-to-face at school, working for their parent Twitter as rivaling burger companies, and then there's also a anonymous app that they are communicating on, but they don't know that it's one another. And I think each element just brought something else to the table and created a whole nother level in their relationship, and I loved it. So that was definitely a 5 out of 5 star read for me. Next up, I buddy read Steel Crow Saga by Paul Kruger with Leah from Where in the World is Leah Jane, and I gave this a 5 star. I thought it was fantastic. This was also a swap out for Care of Magical Creatures, read a book with a beak on the cover. So yes, this was my Avatar cross Pokemon love baby. I adored the kind of Pokemon elements to it. I can see the faults, and you know, it wasn't perfect, but for me it was a perfect read. I thought that every element of the story was interesting and engaging. I felt that the different nations were distinct in their own right, and I just loved each of the characters. Also, the female-female relationship in this did things that just made me very happy and also sad, but then really happy. The only thing that I don't agree with would be one of the relationships at the end. But aside from that, I think each component of it was so well done. I think the blurb on the back probably gives a good indicator of what it is. A soldier with a curse, a prince with a debt, a detective with a grudge, a thief with a broken heart. A band of rogues and royals who should be enemies might find a common purpose unites them, defeating an unstoppable killer who defies the lords of magic, and in the process they'll change their life. Go pick it up, go read it, go on. I think it was fantastic. Next up was my original Care of Magical Creatures book, and that is Scar by Alice Broadway. Every time I get distracted by that cover. With Steel Saga being so much larger, I figured let's bump up our Magical Readathon page count. Like, it doesn't matter to me, but you know, it's cool seeing everyone that participates in the readathon reach like over 1 million pages read or whatever. So that helps that up. This is the finale in a trilogy. The first one is Ink, the second one is Spark, and then Scar, following Lenora, who lives in a society where you get your achievements tattooed on your skin, and when you die, your skin is made into a book, which is then judged, and if it is judged worthy, your book will stay in your family's home and you are honoured and lived on. If not, it gets chucked in the fire and burnt, and so you are considered a forgotten. Your family are no longer allowed to speak your name, and this follows after Lenora's father has passed away, and I'm disappointed. So this is a 3-star read for me because I was let down by the ending. There was closure, but there wasn't anything that made it substantial. The antagonist of the stories just collapsed under its own weight, and there was, I love Lenora and all the Blanks characters. A Blank is someone who doesn't have the tattoos. I think that the stories they tell are really interesting. There's a fairy tale element to it, but they were sustained within the first 2. So this was just to wrap it all up, and I don't feel like it wrapped up well enough to be worthy of anything higher than a 3-star. I think for most people, being a YA dystopian that has very similar feelings to The Giver, I would pick it up only if it really interests you, not be sucked in by the covers like I were. I don't regret, I loved Ink with all of my heart. That was a fabulous read, but I also wish it was just summed up better. For me, Ink was 5, Spark was 4, and then this was a 3. So yeah, up to you. I recommend Ink, but at the same time, it doesn't conclude. You need to get to Scar. Next up was for the Elderling Along, hosted by the Catch Up Book Club, which is run by Becca, and that was Royalists Awesome by Robin Hobb. This is the second in the Farseer trilogy, and I just decided to read the whole thing in 1 month, so then I could alternate between the Cosmere Along and Elderling Along instead of having to read them all in 2 months each. So this is following Fitz as he tries to navigate the political climate of the 6 duchies. Fitz has a power that is looked down upon by the community, which is called the Wit, where you have affiliation to animals, and it becomes more prevalent in this book, which I loved. I thought it was very cute. Night Eyes is one of my favorite characters of all time, and yeah, just seeing the dynamic that happens with all the different players of the court was really fascinating. I think I'm nervous for Assassin's Quest because the ending went a direction that I should have seen coming, but I didn't. So yeah, definitely would recommend. This was definitely a 5-star read for me. I adore these characters, and I think that's the hard part when the plot is so expansive and yet so contained. Definitely would recommend picking up Assassin's Apprentice, and then Royalist Awesome. And this was my last Defense Against the Dark Arts. Read a book that's set on a coast. This is definitely set in the coast, as Buckkeep is on the water's edge. The last physical book I read was Jane Steele by Lindsay Fay, and I read this with Sam from A Bear and Bean Books, as talked about with Be Not Far From Me. We decided to do the buddy read as we had read Jane Steele last month and wanted to read a retelling. So I thought this was really interesting. This is a book. Yes, obvious, I know. But I did not know what I was getting myself into when we started reading this. I ordered it because she was like, would you like to read this? I said, sure, sounds good. I didn't actually look at a synopsis. Meet Jane Steele. Orphan, governess, serial killer. Like the heroine of the novel she adores, Jane Steele suffers cruelly at the hands of her aunt and schoolmaster. And like Jane Eyre, they call her wicked. But in her case, she fears the accusations are true. When she flees, she leaves behind the corpses of her tormentors. Yeah, that's a thing that happened. So surprisingly, like, based on how I've talked about it, I gave this 4 stars just because it was a ride. You start off with the first sentence being, of all my many murders committed for love and for better reasons, the first was the most important. Okay, girl, you say that. I felt like each element of Jane Eyre was represented in this, but twisted on its head and made murderous and made dark. I thought it was fantastically done. I only read Jane Eyre last month, and I'm not a classics reader. I didn't have that strong emotional connection, which I know a lot of people do, to Jane Eyre, but I can appreciate it more now reading a retelling, because it highlighted to me the important things that I'm not always paying attention to. I thought that her dynamics between her and Mr. Thornfield were fantastic, and I loved the whole dynamic of the found family that is prevalent in this. I didn't appreciate the grossness, and it was weird coming from My Dark Vanessa, which has explicit sex scenes in it, to reading this and feeling more uncomfortable than in My Dark Vanessa. There would be quite a few trigger warnings. I can't remember them off the top of my head. There is suicide by overdose. There is sexual harassment. There's attempted rape. There's murder. So yeah, just if you do plan on picking this up, go in looking at what the story is about mostly. Because still an enjoyable read, really enjoyable read, just wasn't prepared for how twisted it got. And finally, the last 2 things that I read were Volume 6 and Volume 7 of Fairy Tale. This is one of my favourite manga ever. I haven't read much, and I just love how funny it is. Yes, there is quite a bit of sexualization of women in it. Aside from that fault, I love it. I love every person's ability. I love the friendships that they have made. I love the connections, and the stakes just got raised in Volume 7. Like, we're talking some serious shit now. I want to keep reading and just throw my entire TBR for May out the window, but I'm not going to, because that would be silly. I'm going to try and get through my priorities, a couple of extras, and then I can read more. Why am I doing this to myself? But yeah, this is just following a group of people who are part of a guild that have powers, and it's interesting and hilarious, and I would highly recommend it. So that is everything that I read in the month of April. I'm very excited to see what happens in the month of May. God knows it's gonna happen. I don't. And yeah, sorry about it being so long. I just ramble because I can't form a coherent sentence to save my life. Thank you so much for watching. If you've made it all the way to the end, if you'd be so kind as to like and leave a comment and perhaps subscribe to my channel if you're so inclined, I would really appreciate it. We've recently had a little influx in our numbers, and I'm so thankful to be forming a little community, and I can't wait to continue talking to you all about some books. So leave a comment below. What was your favorite read of April 2020? And I will hopefully see you in the next video. Bye!